Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for coming. My name is Sebastian Bistrito. I'm an Associate Programs Officer with the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's debate on whether or not the Second Amendment of our Constitution was a mistake or not. First, a word of thanks to the Arthur and Roop Foundation for their support for tonight's debate and the Center for the Study of Liberal Democracy here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for their assistance with the event. Before I turn things over to one of our student organizers to introduce our speakers, I just want to say a quick word about what we do at ISI. For the last 70 years, ISI has stepped into the breach to educate for liberty on college campuses. We see more and more every day that universities are engaged in a project of cultural repudiation and intellectually and morally bankrupt formation. We see the results of this in the failings of our current leadership class. As part of our mission to educate for liberty, ISI hosts an array of seminars, campus lectures, on-campus societies, and our flagship honors program. So if that sounds like something any of you would be interested in, you can see me after the debate, and I can get you more involved with ISI. You can also visit our website at isi.org. Now I'd like to invite Harrison Wells, who's been instrumental in making tonight possible, to come up and introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us to hear our debate, Was the Second Amendment a Mistake? My name is Harrison Wells, and I'm a senior undergraduate intern at the Center for the Study of Liberal Democracy. I also have the pleasure of introducing our debaters and moderator this evening. CSLD would like to thank the Intercollegiate Studies Institute for helping us put on this great event. Our first debater this evening is Professor Sanford Levinson. Professor Levinson holds the W. St. John Garwood and W. St. John Garwood Jr. Centennial Chair in Law at the University of Texas, Austin. He received his JD from Stanford University and his PhD from Harvard University. He has authored hundreds of articles, books, and more in professional and popular journals. We are very grateful to have Professor Levinson with us tonight. Our second debater is Dr. John Lott. Dr. Lott is the president and founder of the Crime Prevention Research Center. He holds a PhD in economics from UCLA and is the author of More Guns, Less Crime, The Bias Against Guns, and other similar works. He served as the senior advisor for research and statistics in the Office of Justice Programs, and then the Office of Legal Policy in the U.S. Department of Justice. We are very grateful to have Dr. John Lott with us tonight. Finally, Professor Ryan Owens will moderate our debate tonight. Professor Owens is a professor of political science and affiliate faculty in the law school here at UW-Madison. He serves as the co-director for the Center for the Study of Liberal Democracy. Thank you for moderating our debate tonight, Professor Owens. Once again, thank you to ISI for helping us put on this great event. And with that, I will now turn it over to our moderator, Professor Owens.
Thanks, Harrison. Welcome, everybody. I am going to keep my comments brief so that we can go ahead and get right into it, but just a couple of housekeeping mechanisms here, just to let you know the lay of the land here. So each of our speakers is going to begin and speak for about 10 minutes or so. Dr. Lott actually will go first. Dr. Levinson, you will go second, at which point then Dr. Lott will have 2 minutes to respond. Dr. Levinson will have 2 minutes after that to respond, at which point I will ask 1 or 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll just open it up for folks in the floor to ask questions. We do have another microphone as well, so when it does come time to Q&A, Colin, I believe here, will be walking around, so raise your hand up really high so Colin can see you and bring the mic over your way. Having said that, we will at some point here, after I believe both of our speakers go, we're going to put up a QR code up on the screen. It's a QR code that ISI uses, sort of get you to think about the debate, the points that were made, who won, who lost, that sort of dynamic. We all know that this is a nuanced argument, and winning and losing is not quite all it's cracked up to be, but nevertheless, we will show that QR code up there, and you can go from there. So thank you to ISI for putting this on with us. Thank you all for being here, and I will cede the floor now to Dr. Lott.
Okay, thanks. Well, it's a real honor to be here, and I have to say it's a real pleasure having Sandy here. Sandy is a very well-known academic. He kind of was instrumental in starting a lot of the debate about the Second Amendment with his paper in 1989 in the Yale Law Review dealing the embarrassing Second Amendment. and he's also kind of a scholar, so it's a real pleasure to be here. And so anyway, I want to kind of ask you a question to start off with. Can you name me one place in the world, any place in the world, that's banned either all guns or all handguns and seen murder or homicide rates go down, or even stay the same? Because I can't find it. Every single place in the world that's done that, we've seen increases. And you'd think just out of randomness, once or twice, a ban on guns, all guns or all handguns would see, just out of randomness, a decrease. You know, obviously we have two Supreme Court decisions, the Heller and McDonald decisions in 2008 and 2010, that dealt with whether you can have complete bans. But every single time it's gone up. You know, we've tried, and the Heller and McDonald decisions dealt with bans on handguns in Washington, D.C. and Chicago. And I just want to kind of show you basically what happened. So this first graph shows you how murder rates in Washington, D.C. were changing prior to their handgun ban that went into effect in February 1997, relative to the other cities in the top 50 in terms of size. And the city data basically starts in 74, but it was falling. And then after the ban went into effect at the beginning of 77, it went up. And there was no year after that, before the ban was eliminated, that the murder rate in DC was as low as it was prior to the ban going into effect. In Chicago, their handgun ban went into effect in November 1982. And you can see here, here's Chicago's murder rate relative to the other 9 largest cities in the United States. So the top 10, it was falling consistently prior to the ban going into effect. And afterwards it went up. There's no year after the ban went into effect where the murder rate in Chicago was as low as it was prior to the ban going into effect. You know, gun control advocates will go and say that unless you ban guns every place, you can't expect it to go and work as far as the ban goes. You know, it would have been nice if they'd kind of told us that before the bans were passed. But more importantly, it doesn't explain why the murder rates went up. It may explain why it didn't go down, it was being promised, but it surely didn't explain why it went up. And, you know, you could think, well, let's look at whole nations. And I could go through and show you data for a number of nations, but I'm just going to show you some graphs for some island nations, which are kind of presumably the best experiment there, because they have no neighbors that they can readily blame for any problems. And here are just a few examples. The Republic of Ireland banned guns in beginning of 1972. Prior to the ban going into effect, the murder rate was kind of bouncing around, but immediately after the ban went into effect, there was a big increase. Obviously, there was some political violence at the beginning there with that first big spike, and they can go and say that there was a lot of drug gang violence in the last part there. But even if you take out those two periods, the murder rate is significantly higher after the ban went into effect than it was beforehand. And the problem you may face with regard to things like drug gangs is whether or not you're going to be any more successful in stopping drug gangs from getting a hold of guns than you've been able to get them to not be able to go and get a hold of the illegal drugs. Here's Jamaica. Jamaica's ban went into effect in 1975. Prior to its ban in 75, Jamaica's murder rate was remarkably similar in terms of changes to the murder rate that we had in the United States. Immediately after the ban, the murder rate started to go up. There's different types of gang violence that were occurring, but again, the bans weren't able to stop the drug gangs from getting a hold of weapons. And even if you take out those periods there, you still have a big increase. Here's the UK. The UK had its handgun ban go into effect in 1997, January 97. And in the 8 years after the ban went into effect, its homicide rate rose by 50%. It starts to come down after that, but still even when you go out for 17 years, the homicide rate was virtually the same as it was before the ban went into effect. And there's a simple reason why it peaked and started to fall. It had nothing to do with the kind of a delayed effect from having a ban. It has to do with the fact that people were upset about the rise in crime that occurred there. And they wanted to have a lot more police. So within a 2-year period of time, right when you started to see it come down, they had a 14% increase in the number of police officers. Over a 4-year period of time, they had an 18% increase in the number of police officers. More police made it riskier for criminals to go and commit crime, and that's the reason why it finally brought down. But even with all the extra police, you still couldn't get it down below what it was prior to the ban. So why is it that bans have always resulted in higher rates of murder and homicide? Again, you just think out of randomness once or twice, you would get the opposite. And there's a simple reason for that. And that you have to be careful that when you apply laws, that you're primarily not going to get the most law-abiding citizens obeying these laws and not the criminals. Because if you disarm the law-abiding citizens, even if you take a few guns away from the criminals, if primarily disarming the law-abiding, you can make it easier for criminals to commit crime. And this doesn't just apply to bans. It applies to all sorts of gun control regulations that you have to be very careful about. And by the way, this point on murders and homicides, you can also look at suicides. When you see bans, you can see drops in firearm suicides, but total suicides don't change. There's no statistically significant change. Now, look, I'm an economist. Sandy is a law professor. And so, obviously I'm an empirical person trying to look at this. But, look at why we had the 14th Amendment to begin with. If you go through a lot of the debate that happened there, this is after the Civil War, there was concerns about southern states passing laws that disarmed blacks and made them vulnerable to crime that was occurring there at the time. And I would go and argue that one of the big problems that we have today with gun control is that gun control primarily harms the poor and minorities that are there. You take something like May issue laws, which was the reason for the Bruin decision from 2 years ago, saying that basically striking down so-called May issue laws where localities could go and determine whether somebody had a good reason for being able to go and have a concealed handgun. I got the data for Los Angeles County on everybody who had a concealed carry permit. They had, before in the May issue law, they had 341 concealed carry permit holders out of an adult population of about 8 million people. Who did they give the permits to? They gave them overwhelmingly, disproportionately to wealthy whites who were politically connected, who gave large amounts of money to sheriff's campaigns. Only 7% of the permit holders were women. Only 5% of the permit holders were black. Only 6% of the permit holders were Hispanic. Nationwide, permit holders, women make up about 30%. Nationwide, blacks make up about 13% of permit holders. In Los Angeles County, over half the population is Hispanic. Now, is it just in Los Angeles County women didn't have good reasons to protect themselves? That blacks in Los Angeles County just aren't likely to be victims of violent crime? No, it's just the politicians in those places didn't think they had as good of reasons, supposedly, as wealthy whites who are giving large donations to the campaigns. You can look at something like background checks, okay? Everybody wants to stop dangerous people from getting guns. I mean, we frequently hear that there are 4 million dangerous, prohibited people that have been stopped from buying guns because of background checks. That's simply false. What they should say is that there have been 4 million initial denials, and 99+% of those are mistakes. It's one thing to stop a felon from buying a gun. It's another thing to stop somebody simply because they have a roughly phonetically similar name to a felon and similar birthday. Now, why does that discriminate? People tend to have names similar to others in their racial groups. Hispanics have names similar to other Hispanics. Blacks tend to have names similar to other blacks. 34% of black males in the United States are felons. 18% of Hispanic males in the United States are felons. 6% of whites, 3% of Asians. Where are you most likely to see mistakes then? You're going to see mistakes overwhelmingly involving black males and Hispanic males because they're more likely to have names similar to prohibited people. It's an easy fix. All you'd have to do is go and have the federal government have to meet the same standards for doing background checks that private companies have to do. But you know, it's just one example of how gun control laws have been used to discriminate. How much longer do I have? A minute? 2 minutes. So I just want to go through a few basic facts. One, police are the single most important factor for reducing crime. But the thing is, police understand themselves that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crime's occurred. The question is, what should people do when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves? My research convinces me of two things. The people who are the most likely victims of violent crimes are the ones who benefit the most from having the option to protect themselves. The very people that these gun control laws discriminate against in many ways. Basically, poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas. The second group of people who benefit the most are people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. You're almost always talking about young males doing the attack. And when a man is attacking a woman or an elderly person, there's a lot larger strength difference that exists there than when a man is attacking another man. And I could go through other things, you know, the fact that guns are used defensively to stop crimes about 5 times more frequently than they're used to commit them. I could tell you something that over 92% of violent crime has nothing to do with guns, even though we always talk about gun violence. And just to summarize this, I'll show you a couple of things here. What do police believe? Here's one example from Police One, which is the largest organization of police in the United States. On a 1 to 5 scale, how important do you think legally armed citizens are in reducing overall violent crime? 76% of police officers think that armed, law-abiding citizens are either very or extremely important in reducing crime. You ask them about stopping mass public shootings. Overwhelmingly, 86% of police officers think that getting rid of gun-free zones, allowing people to protect themselves, will either eliminate or greatly reduce the harm from mass public shootings. And I probably don't have time, but maybe there's questions. There's lots of claims out there about the rate of mass public shootings in the United States, and I would like to go through the different definitions. But if you define a mass public shooting as 4 more people killed in the United States in a public place, not involving some other type of crime like a gang fight over drug turf or a robbery, because when you hear these numbers like 600 mass shootings, about 80% of those are gang fights. Almost all the rest are things like robberies where people are being shot. And most of them involve cases where people aren't even being shot, to include it. What you find over the last 25 years, between 1 and 8 of these mass public shootings have occurred. Anyway, I appreciate your time. But the bottom line is that one of the reasons to have the Second Amendment, just like when we had the 14th Amendment apply the Bill of Rights to the states, is try to protect the most vulnerable people in our society. The majority, in many cases, which one could go and argue the whole point of the Constitution is to protect minorities, the majority in southern states at that time was disarming the poor and blacks. And we have many laws doing the same thing these days. But I greatly appreciate your time. Thank you very much. Is that okay?
Thanks. I too want to express my appreciation to be here this afternoon and to debate John. Though the debate is somewhat, what we're debating is somewhat misleading in that John is really talking about gun policy. And I have no doubt that gun policies raise all sorts of controversial issues in which empirical evidence really is important. And I have no doubt that I disagree with John on some things. I also have no doubt that we agree on some things. Just to give one not completely random example, I think that Martha Stewart, though a convicted felon, should have a right to own a handgun if any ordinary citizen has a right to own a handgun, because the felony for which she pled guilty was nonviolent. And the idea that we have of a felon doesn't conform with the fact that we have very complicated, very extensive criminal justice rules in which probably all of us, under one definition or another, could be found guilty of some felony, presumably nonviolent. So if we were debating gun policy, first of all, I wouldn't be here because I don't know enough. We're not really debating gun policy from my perspective. We're debating whether or not the Second Amendment was a mistake. And I want to begin by saying, well, mistake when? I am, in fact, very critical of the U.S. Constitution. I'm one of the few people, certainly one of the few people identified with the left, who thinks that we need a new constitutional convention in order to bring it up to date and to cure some of its manifest deficiencies. Does that mean that I engage in founder bashing? The answer is no. I don't think it's very profitable to say, well, did the framers make mistakes? Because I think it is true, whether or not one is talking about framing the United States Constitution, or as one of the people in this audience did, helping to frame the South African Constitution, I think that framers at the time they act do what they think best given the political situation. I presume that all of us are appalled by the compromises with slavery that were in the original 1787 Constitution. Gouverneur Morris gave an eloquent speech in the convention denouncing the international slave trade, with the fact that there were those who wanted to give protection to the international slave trade for 20 more years. He ended up accepting it because he thought that it was more important to have a constitution than to run the risk of 2 or 3 divided countries along the East Coast that would almost inevitably emulate Europe and get into constant war with one another. Similarly, James Madison defined giving equal voting power to Delaware and Virginia as an evil. He said, though, it was a lesser evil, because the greater evil would have been no constitution. I happen to agree with James Madison that the United States Senate in 1787 and the United States Senate in 2024 is an evil. One of the things I would like to do in my projected constitutional convention would be to address why it is that, for example, Wyoming has the same 2 senators as California, or Vermont has the same 2 senators as Texas. Slavery is obviously evil. You don't have to have a sophisticated argument, but that's not the real point. The point is you would have to say, do you agree or disagree with conscientious, smart people in 1787 that one had to make some really awful compromises in order to achieve the goal of a constitution that would unite 13 states, only 11 of which were in the Union when George Washington was inaugurated, because my home state of North Carolina and Rhode Island had not yet ratified the Constitution. They weren't fans of the Constitution. New York ratified the Constitution by the overwhelming vote of 30 to 27 in their state constitutional convention, ratification convention. So these are real political issues. And the reason I don't bash the founders is because they were doing the best they can. There are times, quite frankly, when I think, well, maybe we would have been better off without a constitution and seeing what 2 or 3 separate countries might have looked like. And then other times they say, you know, there is no really good reason to believe that that would have led to peace and happiness and even justice. It would have led to a very different world from the one we've lived in, but there's no good reason to say, oh, that would have solved the problems that the framers were trying to adjust to. So I do not bash the founders for making a decision. Incidentally, one of the decisions they made was to exclude a Bill of Rights from the initial Constitution. They didn't think it was important. I think there's much to be said for that judgment. The Bill of Rights was totally unimportant in explaining American constitutional politics until roughly the 20th century. Um, but part of the deal to get ratification from some of the people who objected to the Constitution was to write a Bill of Rights in order to stave off a second convention that would have done much more harm, because most of the sophisticated opponents of the Constitution didn't object only to the lack of Bill of Rights. They objected to some of the structures that had been created in 1787. So in any event, the people I want to bash are not the framers. They are us today. We are the problem, not the framers. That I like many of the framers, even if I don't like everything they said or everything they stood for. I like the fact that Alexander Hamilton began Federalist Number 1 by saying that America was presenting a genuine model to the world that was asking the question, were people capable of engaging in reflection and choice as to how they wished to be governed? Because that was really brand new. Before that, you had kings claiming to be appointed by God, or you had parliaments in which very, very few people could participate, far fewer than was the case even in the United States then, though, of course, even then, enslaved people, women, propertyless males were usually excluded. But Federalist One is very inspiring. Are we capable of reflection and choice? And my complaint is that we very rarely engage in reflection and choice on whether we are well served by decisions made over 225 years ago in a country where the 1790 census, 4 million people. My state of Texas has 28 million people today. California has 40 million people. The country began in what we now call Maine. It extended and to the southern border of Georgia and over to the east bank of the Mississippi River. Today, it extends into the mid-Pacific, and depending on your theory of Puerto Rico, it may go into the Caribbean. We are wildly more diverse, even than the United States was in 1790, which is still remarkably diverse. So the question is, do decisions made in 1787 or 1791, or even 1868, because John is right about some of the radical implications of the 14th Amendment. He's right about the role that access to guns played in protecting vulnerable African Americans against the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorists. But still, that's quite a while ago. And the question is whether or not in 2024 we are well served by the Second Amendment, and whether we might decide in the convention that I really do want that the Second Amendment, all things considered, is a mistake. And I think it is. Let me take literally 2 more minutes, is that all right, to say why. First of all, if one agrees with John on his critique, you actually don't need the Second Amendment, because almost all of the states in the Union are very protective of guns. Heller was an outlier. The District of Columbia, which of course is not a state, did choose to ban guns, and I actually am willing to defend the Heller decision that said that was unconstitutional. I'm not willing to defend the decision written, the opinion written by Justice Scalia, because from my perspective, it had nothing to do with the Second Amendment. It had everything to do with the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment, if one is going to get technical. But the reason this distinction is important is that the Second Amendment is in the Constitution in the first place because of the suspicion that the national government would become tyrannical. And you needed the possibility of an aroused public that could take up arms to overthrow a tyrannical government. It has nothing to do with self-defense against criminals. There are other ways, other parts of the Constitution that one can look at in order to defend the basic right of self-defense. And John and I both agree that there is a basic right of self-defense. It's just that doesn't explain why the Second Amendment is in the Constitution. So if we had a convention today and engaged in reflection and choice, say, okay, what do we want the Second Amendment to do? Do we want the Second Amendment to license the very, very widespread availability of all sorts of weapons, arms, not simply handguns, all sorts of weapons, to make more likely the ability of an armed uprising against a potentially tyrannical national government? Now, this isn't a silly question. We could have a serious argument about it, but that's really what the Second Amendment is about. It's not protecting vulnerable individuals against criminals. The fact is, most states do a quite good job of doing that, and you don't need a Second Amendment. The other reason I would get rid of the Second Amendment if we had a revised Constitution is because, frankly, it gives way too much power to judges who know almost nothing about the empirical evidence that John brings forward. You know, we could have interesting arguments about the empirical evidence and inference from statistics and things like that. The Supreme Court doesn't include anybody on the current court who confesses to competence in basic statistics. In fact, Chief Justice Roberts ridiculed the very idea that social science might be relevant. If there are those who say, well, we don't need statistics or empirical data because we should simply do what they did in 1791, it is also true that there is nobody on the current Supreme Court who's a competent historian. Even though both John Roberts and Elena Kagan majored in history, that does not make them competent historians the way academics describe it. So what we have is a bizarre situation. And, John asked you, can you, name any country in the world where murder rates have gone down, if guns have been banned? I suspect he's correct. I have no reason to doubt his basic argument on that. But I don't know that you can name another country in the world that has handed over such remarkable power to judges to make one-size-fits-all judgments about the availability of firearms all across the country. So this is a group of people who profess to see literally no difference between Manhattan in 1791 and Manhattan today in terms of what might be sensible regulation of firearms. We're not talking about bans. We're talking about regulation. I confess to being naive enough and little d democratic enough to believing that policy disputes of the kind that we could have if this were a somewhat different debate and only about gun policy, that these kind of policy disputes are best handled in the political sphere rather than being turned over to judges in whom we have no good reason to place confidence.
I'll probably go on. Okay. Well, I really appreciate, as I've said before, Sandy and his comments. I guess one of the questions, if you're going to evaluate whether or not the Second Amendment has been good or not, it seems you have to go and look at the decisions there and whether or not they've improved situations or not. And so you look at the Heller decision, you look at the McDonald decision, the bans. Was it good that they struck down the bans? Did that improve safety? I'm an empirical person, obviously, as Sandy's pointed out. And, to me, that's the way you have to look at it. The Bruin decision, you had states like California. He says state constitutions protect them. And many states have even stronger protections in their constitution than we have with the Second Amendment. But, Sandy, who wrote the article and the embarrassing Second Amendment, which is being ignored by the courts and everything, maybe you can tell us how the states have completely ignored their provisions in the constitutions there. But I look around and I see the Bruin decision. I have 7 states that made it so that people had to provide a good reason. Well, you say the current thing protects victims and minorities. I look at California. I look at Los Angeles County, 341 permits out of 8 million adults. And who do they give it to? Overwhelmingly wealthy people. Am I glad that wealthy people have been able to go and get guns for protection? Sure, that's great. But they're not the ones who are the most likely victims of violent crime. And that's what you see over and over and over again with these laws. And so just like, the 14th Amendment taking care of a severe problem that existed after the Civil War, I see the people who are the most vulnerable in our society being prevented from being able to go and protect themselves. And as far as the Constitution interpretations being extreme right now in terms of all weapons, I see, first of all, the two sets of decisions that we've had so far dealing with whether people could own handguns, okay? Most guns in the United States are handguns. And the other one with whether people are allowed to carry handguns without having to provide a good reason to some Democratic official in those states which are heavily Democratic, and the discrimination that occurs there. Now, my own guess is that the Supreme Court's not going to say that people can go and own machine guns, all right? That you go and you look to see what they're going to say. They're going to say commonly owned weapons, AR-15s and whatever. They may be demonized in some sense. But AR-15s, despite what you may hear weapons of war, even the Associated Press says that's a meaningless term, okay? No militaries around the world use AR-15s. The versions that we see being used in the United States, there's no mass public shootings involving automatic weapons in the United States. And what you see happening is AR-15s is that applauding me or no?
No.
Okay.
My fault.
AR-15s are basically semi-automatic guns, semi-automatic rifles, small caliber semi-automatic rifles that fire the same bullets with the same rapidity, doing the same damage as any semi-automatic hunting rifle. Over 85% of the guns in the United States are semi-automatic. To go and use terms like weapons of war and what have you is extremely misleading. And yet, so I look so far. So if the question is, has so far the decisions the Supreme Court made the country safer or not, I think the evidence is pretty strong that it's made it safer. You look at what happened in D.C. and Chicago. You look at the Bruin decision and who is being discriminated against, the very people that need it the most. Now, maybe at some point in the future, there'll be some case where I'll agree completely with Sandy that they've interpreted it in a way that may go and endanger things. But, that's a guess. I can just say at this point where we stand on these types of decisions from the court. Thank you.
Yeah, it strikes me there's something very, very peculiar about the two positions we're taking, because I think it's fair to say, and I think John would deny, that he's usually viewed as being political conservative, and I'm usually viewed as being somewhere on the left. If I agreed with him in terms of his empirical argument, that is, the deprivation of guns makes vulnerable groups that I care about more at risk. And if they had more guns, they would feel safer. Then, quite frankly, liberal that I am, I would be supporting governmental programs that would place guns in the hands of the vulnerable, because like medical care, like education, like all sorts of goods, guns don't fall from heaven. They have to be bought. And in a society as radically inegalitarian as ours has become, then all of you know that these goods are rationed by price. And, again, as a bleeding heart, I support things like Obamacare and Medicaid, because I think that protections against risks, certain risks, should be taken out of the market system to some extent and be supplied by the state. So I'd say if I really agreed with John on all of his data, then the question I would ask, and it would be a serious question, not simply a kind of gotcha debate question, of should conservatives support governmental programs that would supply guns at low or no cost to people who can't afford them. And if you really do care about the vulnerable and believe, in addition, that the vulnerable are the major losers from restrictive gun laws, then it seems to me that one would support a new liberal democratic program to put guns in the hands of all vulnerable people who cannot now afford to buy first-rate or even second-rate weapons through the market.
Well, let me pick up there, actually, and ask a question. Is that something that you think the government ought to entertain?
No more than I think the government should be dealing with healthcare or some of these other things. But here to me is maybe there's a compromise in the middle that we can reach, and that is the government imposes all sorts of taxes and fees and restrictions on people being able to go and get guns. So in Washington, D.C., where they're voting on a lot of this stuff, it costs $125 to do a background check on a private transfer of a gun. That may not stop Sandy or I from being able to get a gun. That's just the cost of the background check. I'll give you an example there. If Sandy and I lived there and I gave Sandy 4 guns, you would think it's just John giving Sandy 4 guns. It should just be one background check. The same guy's getting all 4 guns. And yet they require a separate background check on each gun, so it would cost $500. California, state after state that has these so-called universal background checks, has the background check on each gun that's there. Give me a benign explanation for why they do that. Who do they think they're stopping from getting the guns? I'll give you one other simple example. Compare Illinois and Indiana, 2 neighboring states. You're not right next to Illinois. 4% of the adult population in Illinois has a concealed carry permit. In Indiana, it's 23%. Why the difference? In Illinois, it costs $450 to go through the process to get a concealed carry permit. In Indiana, it's $0. They don't even charge you for the background check. But it's more than just the percent of people. It changes the mix. In Illinois, when it's $450 just to get the permit, we're not talking about the price of the gun that Sandy's bringing up or other things. Who do you think you're stopping? It's basically wealthy whites who live in the suburbs. In Indiana, you see much higher rates of permits in poor minority zip codes that are there. So, we can talk about the government subsidizing. I just would be happy if the government stopped putting these extremely heavy fees and taxes where it's basically preventing the most vulnerable people in a society from being able to go and protect themselves. That would be a huge change if they would do that. And the irony is what states do this? It's basically the heavily Democratic states that put these heavy fees that prevent poor and minorities from being able to go out and get guns, not the Republican states. In Texas, where Sandy's from, a few years ago, when there was a vote to reduce the fee for concealed carry permits from $140 down to $40, all the Republicans voted for it, and all but one of the Democrats voted against reducing the fees from $140 to $40.
So let me switch gears here slightly with this. Sandy, you talked a little bit about the constitutional matter here. So a lot of the folks in the audience, I think, are aware of the Supreme Court's Bruin test, looking to text history and tradition to figure out whether a law would pass muster. Could you maybe explain why you think that's either a workable or an unworkable test, and maybe where the Supreme Court might be headed with that today in the Rahimi case?
Well, it would take probably the rest of our time together on why Bruin is, as I was quoted in the New York Times last week, bonkers in its basic analysis. The notion of tradition in a country, first of all, going back only 1787, Justice Harlan once spoke of the traditions from which we developed as well as the traditions with which we broke. One doesn't have to subscribe entirely to the 1619 Project to believe that one of the deepest traditions of American history is white supremacy and structuring institutions in order to preserve white supremacy. And so John, at an abstract level, is saying a number of things that I could agree with. That is, there has always been a sensitivity to who it is who actually has guns. One of the reasons I so dislike Justice Scalia's opinion in Heller, which again, I support in terms of the outcome, the best single support for Justice Scalia's position saying that DC's prohibition of guns was unconstitutional is from Dred Scott. Some of you may have heard of Dred Scott. It is usually viewed as the worst opinion, most indefensible opinion in our history. Dred Scott is actually very interesting in many ways. It was despicable in lots of ways. But it's also the case that Chief Justice Taney, unlike many of his successors, thought that citizenship was really important and brought with it a bunch of rights. And he listed what the rights were. And guess what? One of the rights was the right to bear arms. This is 1857. I have been teaching my students for some years. In fact, this was a paragraph in the Yale Law Journal article that John adverted to, that one of the explanations for Taney's decision that African Americans, blacks, could not be citizens, a despicable decision. There's no argument about that. But why did he feel compelled to go that route? Because if blacks were citizens, they could have guns. That was unthinkable to Taney in 1857. And John is absolutely right. It was an item of great debate in 1868. And that is something that has to be addressed, the distributive consequences of who owns guns, how easy it is to get guns, when you're more likely to be patted down or stopped, etc. But as somebody from Texas who's not particularly fond of Texas politics, I think it is just false to say that the Democratic Party that voted for the higher fees, even if I agree with you that they have distributive consequences, because fees I'm enough of an economist to know that costs matter, that they didn't vote overwhelmingly to raise the fees in defiance of their black and Hispanic constituents. That rightly or wrongly, many of their constituents feel insecurity and anxiety about the widespread availability of guns and think the state should do something about it. Now, if we were debating policy and only policy, we could say, you know, they're wrong. They really would be safer if more people had guns, and maybe you'd come over to my state subsidizing of guns. But I don't think in the 21st century it is accurate to say that the Democratic supporters of gun regulation are in the pockets of the white supremacists. That was true in 1868. Democratic Party was undoubtedly a white supremacy party in 1868. That's not American politics today, and to understand the politics of guns, even if they have some of the distributive consequences that John outlines, it just doesn't capture the situation to say that this is part of a targeted effort to make life more difficult for the most vulnerable citizens.
So I want to make sure that we get some folks.
Could I just say one thing? I'm not saying that they're doing it out of racism. I'm just saying that's the practical effect of it. And the court is acting in a way to protect that vulnerable, those
One
rights
just
of the vulnerable
last point,
people.
15 seconds. This particular Supreme Court is spectacularly indifferent to the distributive consequences of public policy with regard to the consequences for the vulnerable. So,
Well, I've talked to Gorsuch. I know him a tiny bit, and I'm not going to speak for others, but I think that he, for one, cares about the types of issues that I'm raising.
Okay, so I want to get the audience questions in here from time to time. Colin has a microphone. If you've got a question, get that hand up real high. He will come up and you can ask.
Hello, thank you guys both for being here. And I guess my question is, how would you advise the federal government to address these problems, and what role do you think they should play currently in your understanding of these issues? And like you said about the Constitutional Convention, if we were to address the gun issue in a new constitution, how would you want that done?
I would probably leave it up to the states or to cities. That one of the things that is truly crazy, and I use that word advisedly, with the Bruin decision, is that a majority professes to see no difference between Manhattan in 1791 and Manhattan today in terms of what cities or states, highly urban states, might believe would be sensible gun regulation. I am not for the banning of all handguns for a variety of reasons, among which that it would create too many criminals. People, that is, who would continue to own guns indifferent to what the national government might say. But one of the great opinions in American history is a circuit court opinion by Frank Easterbrook, a very conservative professor at the University of Chicago who's on the Seventh Circuit. This was before McDonald, who said, as a conservative, I believe in federalism. As a conservative, I believe that local people are the best people to decide what sorts of regulation they need. And perhaps as a Chicagoan, I believe that maybe Chicago is different from downstate Illinois, and that regulations that make sense in Chicago might not make much sense in downstate Illinois. And instead, what the Supreme Court wants to say is forget everything you know about the remarkable diversity of this country in terms of population, topography, people who hunt, people who would never dream of hunting, etc., and just assume there's a one-size-fits-all solution that can be discerned by members of the United States Supreme Court.
Well, I mean, I guess if we're going to take that logic, does that apply to the First Amendment? Do we go and they say Louisiana, when they passed a tax just on newspapers, we say, well, one size doesn't fit all, with regard to the First Amendment for different states? The reason why we apply it to the states, and the reason why the 14th Amendment applied the Bill of Rights to the states, was to try to protect minorities in those places. That, Huey Long didn't like the opposition there, so he wanted to go and punish their newspapers, and he put taxes on them in that place. And the Supreme Court stepped in and they said the power to tax a fundamental right was the power to destroy a fundamental right. And so the issue that we have here is why, if we want to take this argument that we should allow individual states to kind of go their own way, put in their own parts of their own constitutions on these things, my guess is we'd have a lot of problems with regard to respecting religion in different places. We'd have a lot of problems with respecting to free speech or to the free press. Do we want to have that? I would say probably no. I'd say there's a reason why we have the Bill of Rights and applying it broadly to the whole country that's there.
Other questions? Oh, got one up here.
I always find it a little bit when we talk about guns interesting that you need a permit for a gun, or you need a license to get the gun. You have to have the background check, but there is no training whatsoever required of you. You need it for the cops need to get trained. If you're drafted, years ago when people got drafted, those people might have never picked up a gun. They had to get trained. Now you can just go out, buy it. You turn 18, you can go out, get a background check, buy a gun. So I think when we're talking about guns, and it might go to what Professor Levinson is saying, that it is so unique in so many situations that it's really hard to, I know you have to apply, do you have the right to own a gun or don't you? But I think we don't always get at the nuances or the facts about stuff. So you say, okay, a cop has a gun and it's right on their hip. If I had a gun in the house, it'd make me extremely nervous. And the reason is it would have to be loaded and close to my bed in order to be effective. And then what if I don't hear somebody come in and then I'm going to be shot anyway? Or let's say I heard something and I'd feel guilty if I shot somebody. So then, you see soldiers that are always saying, do I shoot somebody? Or even cops have to make difficult decisions with this. So you say, are you a cautious person? Aren't you a cautious person? And it always strikes me that, probably most of the women in here, I might guess, would feel nervous if they had a gun in the house. But if you might go to an urban area, they might not.
So what's the question?
I just think it's too broad of a thing, and I think people should do more. If you're gonna debate this, I think, or study this, I think people should ask surveys: who has the guns in the house, and who's been trained to use those guns, and who feels
perhaps
safe.
Professor Lott could speak to that.
You brought up a lot of points, but let me just make a couple things. Do you think people need to be trained before they vote? Do you think so? I mean, that's partly a rhetorical question. Yeah, just wait a second. It's partly a rhetorical question there. But look, we have a lot of empirical evidence on the type of issue you're talking about. Most states don't require people have to go and get training to get a concealed carry permit. What's been the behavior in those states? Do you have problems with them? If you look across the country, you find that concealed carry permit holders are convicted of firearms-related offenses at 1/12 the rate that police officers are. They're convicted of firearms-related offenses at 1/240th the rate of the general population. The thing is, when you may not mandate they get training, but there's evidence that you may not mandate that people get training in many of these states, but you can see, for example, when states move from right to carry laws that did require training to constitutional carry, we have now 28 states that have so-called constitutional carry, there's evidence that what happens is you see large increases in the percent or the rate of people going to get training, because law-abiding people know that they have a lot to lose on that, even without the mandates from training. Often when you have the mandates from training, one of the problems is that you have politicians that get involved and have all sorts of crazy things. Like California, 16 hours, 2.5 hours of your training requires safe storage. And basically, they're trying to convince you about you shouldn't own a gun because it's dangerous. Basically putting out false information there. When you move to constitutional carry, what you find is that the courses become more focused on things that are actually relevant for the people there. But the bottom line is, do they commit crimes when you don't have the training? Do they go and get training on their own, usually? Because the rate, that's the thing. If I were to ask you, because police, you could say it's hard to convict them for firearms-related violations, but yet permit holders are convicted at 1/12 of the rate that police officers are. That seems incredibly low to me.
No, Professor Levinson, excuse you. Professor Levinson.
Well, just very brief. I agree with the basic thrust of the question, but the real point is that why should this be constitutionalized instead of being fought out in the political process, and people are persuaded by one thing or another, especially given that the Second Amendment is not only very, very old, and lots of things have happened since 1791, but it is in the Constitution for reasons having nothing to do with the murder rate. Now, as I say, I think there are other parts of the Constitution, Privilege and Immunities Clause, the 14th Amendment, the 9th Amendment, a famous book of which was called The Forgotten Ninth Amendment, that you could draw on to defend the basic right of self-defense and therefore perhaps the basic right to own a handgun. But the fact that it is constitutionalized and ultimately turned over to basically ignorant federal judges to make one-size-fits-all decisions strikes me as something we would not choose to do if we had a new constitutional convention. This does not require founder bashing. It requires bashing us.
Well, surely the
help with that.
14th Amendment, in incorporating the Bill of Rights to the state, in particular the debate over the Second Amendment, dealt specifically with murder.
Murder by Ku Klux Klan, yeah.
All right, we've got brief question. Time for one final question. Be as brief as you possibly can, please, because we are running out of time.
Okay. Hi, so I'm in the class Military History of the United States, and from my understanding and what we learned, so like there was the Elizabethan tradition, like the British tradition of a standing army, and then after the Revolution, like the colonists were very scared of a standing army because of what happened with like the Boston Massacre and everything, and so after the Revolution, Congress passed like a dual army of like a standing army, but then they allowed the Second Amendment for like a well-regulated militia, like people could have like bear arms because of that fear of a standing army. So my question, I guess, for Professor Levinson, but both of y'all can answer, what do you think then the framers should have done? If you're saying that the Second Amendment was a mistake, what do you think that the framers should have done to sort of alleviate the fears of a standing army while also giving rights to the colonists to bear arms?
So let me interject briefly. I apologize. So this will be the last answer that we have here. And I want to say two things. Number one, the QR code, which is above you, feel free to check that out. Engage with that if you are so inclined. Number two, if each of you, when you answer this question, if you want to just put your concluding thoughts into it as well, so we don't have a separate time period for that.
It's a very, very interesting question. There is no doubt that there was a great fear of the standing army. That is why a number of people opposed the Constitution. That may be why Rhode Island was not really eager to ratify it. That might be why some of the New Yorkers voted against it. It is an important feature of the Constitution that it does authorize a standing army. It's also true that George Washington really did not think that we won our revolution, or what I prefer to call our successful secession from the British Empire, because of the sturdy farmers and their muskets. We won it in large part because the French helped us, and French helped us with military aid at Yorktown. Thomas Jefferson, who was no fan of national universities, established West Point in 1804 to train a professional military, because he thought that was important. But there is certainly this whole myth we have of the citizen militia. And you can certainly trace the Second Amendment to the esteem for the citizen militia. That still doesn't lead to the Second Amendment being about individual self-defense, about somebody breaking into your farm. It is about the idea that an aroused citizenry, like the people in Lexington and Concord, the Minutemen, could, if need be, take up arms and overthrow a tyrannical government. As I say, that's a really serious issue in political theory. I don't mean to be dismissing it, but it obviously has certain consequences. For example, when the Supreme Court, after Reconstruction, basically negated the Second Amendment, which it did. The Supreme Court has not been a friend of the Second Amendment until 2008. That's when they discovered it. The first decision on the Second Amendment neutered it. Then there was a very specific, very interesting decision coming out of Chicago, Presser versus Illinois. Could members, German American in labor unions, who believed quite reasonably that they were being exploited by the owners of the means of production. They were socialists, most of them. So they wanted to collect their guns and engage in training for the possibility of their needing to move against
the capitalists who were exploiting them. Guess what? The state of Illinois said, we're not going to tolerate this sort of paramilitary organization. Guess what? The Supreme Court said, of course you need not tolerate this, because that could really be dangerous. Now, one of the reasons I find Presser so interesting is that you really can have an interesting debate about how tolerant the state should be of groups, either on the left or the right, that might be tempted to overthrow it. That's the really serious issue of the original Second Amendment. And you put your finger on a very important issue. But that's been lost because when I said one of the things that is so embarrassing about the Second Amendment is that nobody, neither liberals nor conservatives, really wanted to address the deep questions raised by the Second Amendment. So instead, the Supreme Court rewrites it as something all about individual self-defense.
Right. Well, look, when you had Lexington and Concord, you had British troops seizing private ownership of guns, okay? They wanted to disarm the colonists and prevent them from being able to go and fight back against them. And, you know, you mentioned well-regulated militia. Well-regulated basically at that time just meant discipline. Didn't mean regulated in the sense that we have now. But I think the important part here is the right of the people, okay? We have the right of the people mentioned a couple other times in the Constitution, and every other time it's mentioned, it's dealing with a general individual right that's there. There's no other time when people think that it applies to something other than individuals. For example, in the First Amendment that's there. And, you know, so the issue that you have to deal with is if people, general civilians, are able to go and own guns, that may make it easier to have a militia. But as Scalia and others have pointed out, just that initial prefatory clause wasn't meant to be completely descriptive of every possible reason that people can go and have a gun. There are plenty of discussions that occurred earlier on in terms of self-defense, and surely by the time we get to the 14th Amendment, we get some fundamental understanding, again, explicitly time after time in the debates, because most of the debate was on allowing people to protect themselves from being murdered or harmed by others that were there. And so, but look, the debate question that we have right now is the Second Amendment, has it been a mistake or not? And the only way I can judge that, as I said before, is to look at the decisions that have been made so far. Did Bruin, did Heller, did McDonald, did they make people safer? Who are being harmed by those? Who are being harmed by those types of regulations that we had at that point? And I would go and argue, it's pretty clear. Just like every other place in the world, when handguns were banned, murder rates went up, okay? Would it be great if the police could protect everybody all the time? Sure, but they can't. And the people who they are least able to protect are often the most vulnerable people, poor blacks who live in our society. Their murder rates went up by far the most after those handgun bans went into effect. With Bruin, the issue was you had Democratic politicians in 7 states that wanted you to provide a good reason. Now maybe blacks and Hispanics didn't have good reasons in New York or in California for why they should be able to go and protect themselves. I look at the huge gap between the percentage of those permits that were granted. Maybe it's just wealthy individuals in those Democratic areas that had good reasons to be able to go and protect themselves. Basically, I see that the Supreme Court stepped in there and protected the most vulnerable people. And just as with the First Amendment applying equally to all the states, I think there's a reason why. Now, maybe in the future, the court will go too far, okay? I haven't seen it yet. We could talk about the types of weapons or whatever, but to me, that's the bottom line in answering. Now, I know I have a very different perspective than Sandy, and I respect him greatly. Sandy is a scholar, okay, in terms of this stuff. I mean, he's somebody who you can have a reasonable discussion with, and is somebody who's been around academia. I've had positions at Wharton, Stanford, University of Chicago, Yale, UCLA. Sandy is unusual for a lot of professors that are there. But you know, to me, if you're going to answer this question, the answer is look at the cases that they've brought and whether or not they've accomplished the type of policy goals that made people safer or not.
Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there. I think we could probably go on for much longer. We will not, however, because you all have places to go, as do we. I want to thank both of our speakers this evening for a very lively discussion and for a very informative discussion. And thank you all for being here. We appreciate your time and everything you do. Thank you.